The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
I'm thinking of a woman I used to see on my way to work years ago. She stands on the corner of Washington and Swan. She looks like she used to sing with jazz musicians. Bessie Smith singing "No One Knows When You're Down and Out." She holds her brow steady, shoulders back like a dancer, dancing in her mind to the songs of struggle and life. She inhales to prep for the question, holds her breath for the answer, exhales to keep from dying because she's met with so much silence. All she hears is her own voice bouncing off the noise that surrounds her, surround sound silencing her. She stands on the corner of Washington and Swan. On the corner right behind the Capitol building, where government don't see her, where vendors sell hot dogs and relish, and the hot sun reminds her what hell is. She's been standing like homelessness never breaks her spirit. Truth is, she's been waiting for change. Not the kind that wrinkles, and not the kind that jingles. Truth is, she's been waiting for change. Wanting to be something, realizing the people who are something aren't sharing the wealth, no knowledge to spare, like these folded bills in their pockets that aren't forgiving or forgiving. She stands on the corner of Washington and Swan where her clock is ticking to the sound of heels clacking the sidewalks, fresh suit tails wagging in the breeze. They wear slacks with sneakers. On their lunch breaks to Dunkin' Donuts for the iced coffees, walk right past her to the vendors to get their french fries and iced teas. Seems like nobody sees what her eyes see. She stands on the corner of Washington and Swan, on the corner where the buses stop, where people carrying bus fare wish they could share what they don't have because they know what lessness is. So close to it, they can taste the gratefulness in them. And she swallows the gratefulness in them that they're not in her shoes. But her melodic voice continues. She's singing the blues. She's singing the blues. She's still singing the blues to the jazz of car horns, jingling keys, the drum of her heartbeat, and one last chord that keeps her unashamed to survive.
You know, it was 2 o'clock in the morning when I pulled in front of my mother's house in Edmonton, Alberta. The trip odometer that I'd set in Schenectady when I left clicked over to 3,000 miles. I'd driven 750 miles that day. I was sunburned because my arm had been out the left window because I didn't have air conditioning. And all the lights of the house were on. And when I went up and rang the doorbell, my mother flung the door open and said, "Guess what? I'm coming back with you." And I said, "No." And I meant it. My mother would spoil everything. This trip had been my great adventure, driving cross country, all the way across the continent. After a difficult divorce and a time of trying to get my life back in order. And it had been a wonderful experience, you know, as I drove through my native land, the land where I was born, past the rocks and the trees and the forests and the lakes. My mother would not understand. My mother would talk too much. My mother would not talk about New York State and ask me any questions about myself. My mother would talk about all her friends, and she wouldn't stop. We would not have any heart-to-heart talks. So I spent the next few days trying to convince my mother that it was not a good idea and trying not to feel too heartless in the process. I mean, first of all, there was the matter of her arthritis. My car was tiny and not air conditioned. She would be terribly uncomfortable in that small little car. And then there was the matter of her health. She had a bad heart, she had osteoporosis, her eyesight was failing. She had congestive heart failure. It wouldn't be safe. All those days of driving in my little non-air conditioned car, we didn't even have a radio. But my mother had a plan to change my mind. And over the next few days, pressure was brought to bear. She'd say, Margaret, you know, it must be very boring being in that car all by yourself. You don't even have a radio. I could keep you company. And she said, and as for my health, she said, do you think there are no doctors between here and Schenectady? And just in case, I bought supplemental health insurance for when we're in the States. And what's worse, her friends started talking to me too. Her best friend Jerry took me aside and she said, Margaret, dear, she said, this trip is so important to your mother. She said, she hasn't been down east for years. She hasn't seen her relatives in the Maritimes. And she hasn't seen your brother Vance in Ottawa. And my mother certainly added to that. She says, yes, she said, she says, Russell is blind now, macular degeneration. Same thing I've got. I guess I'll be blind one of these days, too. Sure would be nice to see those relatives again before they're all dead. I trusted my brother and his wife to take my side. They knew how difficult my mother could be. But then they began to start taking my mother's side. I said, well, she really hasn't been down east for a long time, and she does have all her relatives back east. She said, if she did have a heart attack, even die on the way, at least she'd be doing something she likes. You know how she loves road trips. I guess it's the right thing to do. The right thing to do. I think I was cornered. And so after a 2 short visit, my mother and I loaded up the car and we headed east. My mother was dressed, as always, in a full slip, pantyhose, nylon top, polyester skirt, black lace-up shoes. It was July, and it was hot. And just as I feared, my mother talked and talked and talked. She says, that Mr. Hill, did you notice that he made me that lovely planter that's on the patio, the one that's painted green? He's such a nice man. I planted it with nasturtiums. You don't want to give them too much fertilizer, It's not good for them. And Irene, I heard from her the other day, she's got diabetes. It's getting a lot worse. She bakes bread every week. 8 loaves of bread every week, and she can't even eat it. She gives it all away to the neighbors. And your sister, well, I wish that she and Richard would leave the farm and move to town. It's just not good for her. I think that's why she's depressed. It's really not a good place, and she doesn't have enough to do. She needs a hobby. I think she would feel a whole lot better if she would just knit an afghan. Now, I watch the news on TV. You know, those politicians in Ottawa. My opinion, they should all be shot dead. They're less than worthless. And when I watch CNN, your politicians, they might be even worse. No time did we ever share anything beyond that. I didn't tell my mother anything because I really didn't want to share my life. And the hours passed. I suggested we go a couple of 100 miles out of our way to Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, because a friend of mine wanted a T-shirt with a moose on it from Moose Jaw. And my mother said, "Why, certainly. Why not? Of course we should go to Moose Jaw and get a T-shirt for your friend." So we got a very fine T-shirt from Moose Jaw, and we did have a picture taken of the both of us beside the giant moose, the world's tallest moose. We got to Swift Current, Saskatchewan. It's not too much there except a whole lot of spanking new farm equipment. And in Swift Current, we stopped at a motel, and my mother was having a severe angina attack, and I was kind of worried about her. While she took her nitroglycerin, which she liked to call her TNT, I asked the clerk at the register, "Is there a hospital near here?" And I wrote down the directions and stuck them in my purse. We stayed at the motel, and we had dinner at a big Chinese restaurant. We were the only people there except for one other woman, and there was a singer who was singing about the Pembina River in Alberta, and the Pembina River goes right past my sister's farm, 100 miles north of Edmonton. And it occurred to me that I really didn't want my mother to die far from my home, far from Edmonton, her home, far from the Pembina River. We drove through Saskatchewan, and it was hot. I was dressed in a T-shirt and shorts and a dishcloth that I'd gotten soaking wet and wrapped around my neck, and my mother was dressed in a nylon blouse, a polyester skirt, full slip, pantyhose, black lace-up shoes. I decided if we didn't find some shade somewhere, I was going to die of heat stroke. And we stopped to get an ice cream cone because there was a single tree growing beside the ice cream stand. And while we stood in the shade, my mother commented that that ice cream cone was wonderfully delicious. Strawberry was her favorite flavor, next to grape nut ice cream. But you could only get grape nut ice cream in New Brunswick. But since she was going to be in New Brunswick, she'd be able to get some grape nut ice cream. And that would be perfectly wonderful. We got as far as the Canadian Shield, that land north of the Great Lakes. And it was all trees and lakes and rocks. And we hadn't seen a soul for a long, long time. And when we came to some very rustic cabins along the way, I decided if we didn't stop there, we might be spending the night in the car. And inside those cabins were huge numbers of the biggest flying insects I had ever seen in my life. And I got a can of hairspray, and I was leaping from bed to bed, spraying the bugs with the hairspray, gumming up their wings so they couldn't fly, and removing their bodies from the room. Well, what a smart idea, my mother said. How clever of you to think of that. And it did occur to me that other mothers might have complained about a motel room that was full of giant flying insects. We went through a thunderstorm the next day, and the sky was entirely red. I had never seen such a thing before. It was sunset, and with the thunder and all that lightning, the whole sky was lit up with flashes of lightning going through it. And I pulled the car over to the side of the road, and I said to my mother, this is beautiful, and this is why we came, and we should remember this. And my mother felt the same way. We got on a ferry and went to an island, Manitoulin Island. And the only motel we saw had the keys to the rooms hanging on hooks outside the motel, and the office was closed. And there was a sign saying, pick a room, whichever room you want, and pay us in the morning. So we took the keys and we found ourselves a room. And it did occur to us that this was rather trusting of the people in the motel, although since it was an island, maybe there was no place we could go. But both of us liked the idea that the keys were out for us to help ourselves. And as we're driving on this long trip, it did occur to me that over the course of a week, my mother hadn't complained about anything. We had gone through days and days of driving in a tiny car without air conditioning, without even a radio, with not very much to see at all, or maybe everything, depending on your point of view. For most of the time, the most exciting thing we'd seen all day were all the signs warning us of moose on the road. But my mother hadn't complained at all. When we arrived, she went to my brother's. She went to New Brunswick. She spent time with all her relatives and her old friends. Years later, after she died, her friend Jerry came and talked to me, and she says, Margaret, dear, your mother talked about that trip all her life. She talked about what a good time she had. And she said she never forgot it. It was a wonderful trip.
How do we get inducted into a faith or into a culture? I grew up in a small town in central New York, Fulton, New York, and I had two grandfathers that particularly affected my early way of thinking. Both of my parents were teachers. So my grandfather Gillard, my father's father, every morning he was my babysitter or sort of helper to get me dressed early in the morning. And he would stand me up on the table in the dining room so he didn't have to bend down and get those activities going. And as I put on my pant legs one at a time and my shirt one at a time, my shirt sleeves, it would go like this. Angel of God, my guardian dear, to whom God's love commits me here. Ever this day be at my side, to light and guard, to rule and guide. Amen. I was just a little girl, but as I work with young children, I think a lot about how we get inducted into something. And that was both inviting me to faith, but also to my imagination. that I had an angel watching over me. My other grandfather, my mother's father, he was a singer, a big Irish-American singer, and if vaudeville were still around, he'd be up on that stage. Indeed, what he did was start a restaurant so he could come out with all his children and sing barbershop harmony to the guests between the courses. And he would stand at the piano every time we had any kind of family gathering. And he'd watch his adult children sing, and he'd watch the young ones say, "Oh, I have a solo," and encourage them. I can see his hand holding up, like, "You can hit the high note. Come on, hit it." And also he would say, "Tell the story, tell the story," because to him songs were always about emotion and feeling. And I am so grateful for those two men and many more Irish-American relatives for inducting me into the world of story. But it also was very much about opening my heart and deepening my understanding of my place in the world. Wow.
B.G. got up every morning before dawn, before anybody else in the house was up. And she would quickly wrap a sari around her and toss the end over her shoulder out of her way. And the bottom would never be quite straight, because certainly not fashionable, because she would do it in such a rush. And she'd put her hair in a quick little bun, and that wouldn't look so good either. She'd go to the kitchen, and the kitchen was like an 8 by 8 foot windowless cubbyhole of a room, and she would make tea that was hot and with lots of sugar and lots of cream, because everybody in the house liked to have tea before they had their morning bath. And nobody was going to have breakfast until they'd had their morning bath. And there were 11 people in the house. And all she had were 2 little burners. She had a little gas burner, and she had a little charcoal burner, and they were only this high, and they sat on the floor, and she had a little stool not taller than this, and she sat on that little stool and made them all tea. And then she made breakfast, and breakfast was not small. Breakfast was omelet and toast and orange juice and tea and pratas, which are kind of a flatbread. She'd make the dough, and she'd have to roll it out one at a time, and people would have a couple. And after everybody had eaten all this food, she'd start preparing for fruit in the morning. Her husband would say, "Fruit in the morning is golden. Fruit in the afternoon is silver, and fruit in the evening is brass." And she'd agree, but she'd be the one cutting up all that fruit. And after the fruit, it was time to begin lunch, and lunch was big. Lunch would be chapatis, another kind of Indian flatbread, and yogurt, and lentils, and vegetables, and pickles. And she would cook everything sitting on that little stool close to the floor in this tiny room without windows and no refrigerator and no proper stove and no cupboards, just shelves with a few utensils and the food she was going to cook that day. She had a little masala dabba, which is a box with compartments where she kept her spices. And then after that, people would take a little rest, and she would rest a bit after lunch. Or maybe she'd be making Indian pickles, slicing up lemons and salting them and putting them in the sun. And after that, she'd start making afternoon tea with sweets and salty things, and maybe her friends would come to visit, and maybe her daughters and daughters-in-law would be in the kitchen with her, and they would be talking and laughing, and she had a big, hearty laugh. And then after tea, it was time to start cooking dinner, and dinner was bigger than lunch, with several vegetables and more yogurt and pickles and maybe a meat curry and more chapatis and some rice. And after dinner, before people went to bed, they liked to have hot milk with lots of sugar, which of course she would heat up for them. And I know all this because BG was my mother-in-law. And I got married when I was 21. And a few months later, my husband and I went to India to visit his family. Now, before we left, I got a letter from my father-in-law, which suggested that I should emulate his wife, who was a paragon of Indian womanly virtues. In particular, she was perfectly submissive, which is not up there on my list of qualities I was trying to emulate. So I was pretty nervous going to the other side of the world to visit these in-laws, and my mother-in-law didn't speak English, and would they like me? And maybe my mother-in-law would be affected by all the Indian movies she had seen, because not many Indians had come to the West in that time, in the mid-60s. And what they knew about Western women, they mostly got from Western movies, and they tended to believe that Western women smoked too much and drank too much and were like promiscuous. So I was nervous. But think about how much more nervous my mother-in-law must have been, because she sent her son off to Canada to get his PhD, hoping that he'd come home again. But instead he decided to settle in the West, and he'd married a Canadian girl who didn't even speak her language. And they would have children, and her grandchildren would live on the other side of the world. That first night when I was in Chandigarh in Punjab, where they lived, I came to dinner, and the table was all set with all kinds of wonderful dishes that smelled wonderful. My mother-in-law had made a special dish just for me. Now, she had heard that Canadians don't like spicy food very much. And that is true. At least it was true in 1965. And she had heard that Canadians had a special fondness for potatoes. And that is also true, especially in 1965. So she had made a special dish for me. One large, peeled, cooked, unseasoned, cold potato that sat in front of me while I smelled all those delicious other dishes. But I did have the good sense to know that this was the gift of a generous heart, a person who wanted me to be comfortable. So I ate the potato, and then I ate as much as I could of everything else. And fortunately for me, she got the idea, and that was the last time she served me a potato. Weeks went by, and it was soon time for me to go home. And before we left, my sister-in-law Shashi came to me and said, "Babiji, my in-laws never called me Margaret. They always called me Babiji," which means respected older brother's wife. She says, "Babiji, Biji wants you to come to the kitchen. We have a custom in India that when a girl visits her in-laws' family, she isn't asked to do anything for the first 30 days. So she can relax, become comfortable, get to know the family. And then after 30 days, she's asked to make a dessert. And then after that, she's like a full-fledged member of the family. Biji wants you to make dessert. Well, I knew nothing about making any kind of an Indian dessert. But I went to that little 8-foot by 8-foot kitchen with no windows and no cupboards and no stove and no knowledge on my part of how to make any kind of an Indian dessert. And my mother-in-law was sitting on that low stool close to the ground. And on that little gas burner, she had a karai, which is like a wok. And in the wok, she was making halva, Indian-style halva, which is not like Middle Eastern halva. Indian halva is like a thick pudding made of cream of wheat and lots of butter and lots of sugar and cardamom and nuts and raisins. It's very good. And she gave me the spoon and she motioned for me to stir, and I stirred once, and ta-da, I was done. I had made dessert. And my mother-in-law, Biji, she hugged me and she cried. And she said something that I didn't understand, and she ran to her bedroom and she came out with a box wrapped. And when I unwrapped it, inside there was a rose pink sari to celebrate the special moment when I had made dessert. And I kept it for many, many years. And I passed it on to an Indian relative. And I treasured it always, because I did realize that a woman who cooks with a loving heart can cross a whole sea of cultural differences. She was a good woman, and I always cared deeply about her. Thank you.
I dream in a language that feels like home. The words come to mind when I can't find the right ones in English. This language I learned first, the cadence, the dance that sways with my tongue. Le moi parler Creole. When I speak Creole, I have the voice of Haiti in my throat, thirsting to tell stories that may never be translatable, but will always end with hope. And for that, they will always be worth telling.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.